moral obligations, I mentioned earlier that I was very excited about Jackass Forever. It's had me thinking about the types of comedy that play well across generations. And I think it's worth noting that like the first Jackass movie came out like right after 9/11, like early 2002. The TV show I think started airing in a pre 9/11 world. This was stuff that as an old millennial I was obsessed with in like high school and college. And this all came out pre-YouTube as well. Now, I think since the initial Jackass wave, so much of that type of like physical comedy, pranks, stunts, all those sorts of things have all moved to like YouTube and TikTok and digital spaces. So it's interesting to see this movie come back around. And I think what's really shocked me is how excited people seem to be about it. I've only read a couple reviews. I think I've read 3 reviews thus far, all from like good, real film critics, the type of people who, you know, I also will go to read a review of the worst person in the world or drive my car or something. And they have all been like, yeah, this is great. This movie is special. It does something exciting. And I think it's really interesting to see that it's still tapping into something fundamental. But I think it's interesting to see why this plays so well. And this is kind of touches on some conversations that I think people are always having, for example, about shows like Saturday Night Live and the question of like, which era was good? Oh, it used to be good and now it's not. Or the way in which internet is sort of like sped up the internet has sped up the pace of like comedy culture and all these sorts of things. So why does some comedy age really well? Why does some not? What do we think makes it age well? Why do we still like to laugh at grown men getting hit in the balls? Someone explain it to me.
I think some of the examples that you mentioned, your Old Schools and Hangovers and Wedding Crashers, I think you might say like, oh, those haven't aged well. And I would venture to guess that the folks who made them would be like, well, duh, you know, they're gross out comedies or like however you want to call them. Those kind of movies sort of curdle like milk because they're more or less designed to push the boundaries of like of good taste and to be like offensive and edgy and blah blah blah. I think the Jackass thing, and maybe fundamental to its continued appeal, is that the joke is always on them. They're never, you know, putting some, I mean, obviously, like, they're all abusing each other and setting each other up for really upsetting things, but they all consent to be within the space in which those things could happen at any moment. Like, I always think of the gag in, I can't remember which one it's in because these all kind of run together for me. I'm not a Jackass aesthete like you, Michael, but the one where they have the hand.
That's Jackass 3, yes.
On the other side of the door, and they give the guy a tray full of soup, and they tell him to walk through the door or take it back to the back room, and then the hand just smacks the soup into his face, and the thing that they're all laughing about is not that the hand hit him, but that he fell for the soup, that he like acquiesced or he agreed to do the soup, knowing that they're shooting a Jackass movie. How on earth can you be convinced to carry a tray of soup anywhere? And I really like that sort of energy that pervades those movies and the TV show leading up to them, is just that, like, these guys are doing this because they find it funny and they want to entertain each other and by extension a home audience, and it doesn't really ever feel like anyone is a victim within that context.
Yeah, so Rachel, as a comedy writer and performer yourself, I'm very curious your take on all this.
Yeah. I mean, I like what Raymond was getting at, where it's like, it's actually, like, oddly enough, a very consent-based show. Just generally in comedy, we don't like to see people punching down. So punching at somebody who, like, shouldn't be made fun of, like an unsuspecting stranger who didn't know they were in a prank show. So I think Jackass definitely gets it right there. And then also, just on YouTube with the rise of influencers and stuff, I think we really crave authenticity, and that's really important to us. And I think what the Jackass crew gets right, and also what Raymond was getting at, that like them being a group of friends and us getting to essentially like get to hang out with them for 2 hours is like huge, because especially over quarantine, we're so starved for human connection that getting to feel like we're a part of a friend group is like huge for us. I think like comedy in the like early 2000s did used to be more cruel and mean and did punch down. If you look at like the focal point of the jokes, like in Dodgeball, like they have a fat joke, I think within the first 5 minutes. And so I think in general, comedy's just gotten kinder. And as we have a society have been more in tune with like empathy as being a value. And so I think Jackass kind of like in a weird way with its main motivator and theme being friendship has always tied into that kind of idea and made space for that.
Well, it's very fun because, you know, we're thinking about this too in the context of like the divide between mainstream comedy and more like indie or whatever comedy. It is very fun that in Saturday Night Live, a show that, you know, people always go back and forth on, they're one of their newest cast members, who I humbly think is the greatest new addition to the show, Sarah Sherman, huge Jackass head. And someone whose own comedy involves a lot of like
proper internet weirdo.
Yeah,
gore.
physical stuff and body horror and gore.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because like when Sarah got hired by SNL, which like ruled and was really cool, it was sort of like, wait, what? Like, did they get her confused with someone else? Not because her work is bad. It's freaking great. But because I think we think of SNL as a little more like, you know, middle America, mainstream, for everybody.
It's become an institution.
Yeah. But I think there's like this other thing that happens, right, in how we perceive of comedy over time. And this is where, once again, Jackass is interesting because in general, there are, you know, people like Sarah Sherman and people like highfalutin film critics that are excited about Jackass. And there are just like teenagers in middle America who are excited about it. It has this kind of universal appeal. But it's interesting how like some of the people who might be critical of an SNL, let's say, tend to be like media savvy folks who live in major cities, whereas the primary audience of the show is like the country as a whole. In the same way where like a lot of people who might consider themselves very comedy savvy will hang out with their friends and talk about sketches from I Think You Should Leave or their favorite Joe Pera Talks With You moment, whereas nobody watches those shows like on the large grand scheme of things. But I don't know, I wonder what that says too about this split, that I think that there's, you know, a universality to comedy in that everyone likes to laugh, while at the same time it seems like further and further we have a bigger and bigger divide between. And I don't know what the right topography is here towards like artsy indie stuff and mainstream stuff. Rachel, what are you thinking?
Yeah.
I mean, I do think what Jackass has is that it like came out like kind of before streaming was a thing. So like it does have like, it already has the fan base going into it. Whereas like with I Think You Should Leave and Joe Pera Talks to You, it's like, I think Joe Pera is on the Comedy Central app, I'm pretty sure, which is like hard to access. So in one way, I think like what Jackass has is essentially the idea of like, it already has built-in like IP, you know, so it's like ready to go, where all these other shows, there are so many to watch that it's like, I think it would be hard for a show to get that big again because there are so many more choices now.
Yeah. So it's almost like grandfathered in because it peaked in that era and it still has some of that universal appeal. Yeah. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Well, they also have the benefit of like having built their brand in a moment before the market was so diffuse that now they can still kind of capture the conversation with a big movie event, however, you know, every 10 years or whatever, rather than, you know, if they were still competing for eyeballs on, you know, MTV or wherever the show was launched, I think it'd be a totally different conversation. There are very few people across disciplines, whether it's, you know, comedy, drama, whatever, who are going to be able to capture the moment as well as they used to when there used to be more of a monoculture.
Yeah. There's a lot of academic writing about Jackass. And a lot of it makes these really interesting points about how the movie kind of captures this response to the kind of suburbanization of American culture and how so much of it happens against the backdrop of when the world just becomes a bunch of endless parking lots in suburbs and when there's nothing left to do and when it seems like history is over in some senses. How are people going to react other than performatively rebelling against a type of cultural boredom and malaise? And I think that there's still something universal about that, and that these movies are sort of like responding to a world in which we're told that not a lot really matters and which it's hard to find things to believe in and care about. It's this sort of like creative rebellion against a type of like American nihilism, which I think does appeal. And I think it appeals because it's more of like a feeling, like the people that create it get interviewed, they're not saying like, yeah, what we're doing is a performative deconstruction of the milieu of whatever, you know? But I think even if they don't say that, there's something interesting going on that connects to people, which helps it last.
In that sense, it's almost very similar to The Office, which captures like, honestly, when you're in this lifeless, dead place, all you have is each other. And Jackass kind of hits on that too from a different angle that's maybe more like the teen version of like when you're in a dead, lifeless suburb, like your friends are all you have.
It just reminds me of the Johnny Knoxville interview on Hot Ones. At one point, he asks the interviewer, Sean Evans, about like a really hot chili pepper. He just goes, you ever stick one of these up the boot? And Sean Evans' response to him is just like, no, it's not really what we do on this show. It just comes back to that thing of just sort of like this very innocent kind of curiosity that all of these gags that they do sort of springs from.
Right now, we're having a rise in feel-good comedy, which is all well and good. But it does also lead to this feeling of like, I don't know, like sitcoms have always been used to teach morals, but Jackass isn't really trying to do that. I know I personally feel sort of like a little emotionally exhausted, and I just want to watch like joy and fun and not necessarily like have to learn anything from it.
Like, personally, I'm very exhausted by didactic moralist comedy where like the political views of well-off Hollywood writers that haven't met a normal person in 10 years tell me how I should view the world. It's just, I'm gonna give that a hard pass. Hey guys, if you want to hear the rest of the conversation, make sure to find us on your podcast application of choice. And if you want to support Show Me the Meaning or Culture Binge, subscribe and then rate and review on Apple Podcast. Thanks as always for watching. I'll catch you later.